Well, we have a lot to cover in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, and so we'll jump right into it with a little bit of a review of what we've covered in the last session. In the last session, we looked at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 10 to 17. In fact, we even started that section in verse 8. When we looked at the folly of greed and how Solomon in that particular section emphasizes the dangers of greed, and we see so many lessons that he gives to us as he observes life, he observes government, he observes personal life, and he draws out all of these lessons to learn about the insatiability of man's hunger for wealth, and then brings it at an important point in this chapter 5, in verses 18 to 20, to a high text, a key text within Ecclesiastes. And we're going to get there in just a moment to review that. But what we find in chapter 6 is a return to the topic of greed, particularly to the issue of satisfaction and how man is always on this quest for satisfaction. It's very much related to what we saw in chapter 5. In fact, we're going to see that there's many allusions and echoes in chapter 6, verses 1 to 12, of what we've studied already in chapter 5. In Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verses 1 to 9, or even all the way through to the end of the chapter, to chapter 6, verse 12, you have this focus on satisfaction. But sandwiched in the middle is the alternative, the supernatural alternative that Solomon gives us in chapter 5, verses 18 to 20. And this is very important because this text of 3 verses, sandwiched in the middle, serves as the interpretive key to understand what Solomon is doing in the text that precedes it and the text that follows, the one that we're going to focus on this evening. And here is that text. It's called a carpe diem text. We call it a seize the day text, where Solomon leaves behind his discouraging assessment of life under the sun and all the fleetingness that's there, and instead provides us with the true alternative, the only alternative, which is a God-centered alternative. He writes this, Ecclesiastes 5, verse 18, 19, and 20, he says, "Here is what I have seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself in all one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him. For this is his reward. Furthermore, as every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. For he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart." In our last study, we looked at that text at the end of our study and saw that Solomon now, after talking about money and greed, puts all his focus on God. We see God referenced there numerous times in that text. And God is the one who sovereignly gives wealth, and he's the one who sovereignly enables man to enjoy the things that God has given. You see, as Solomon writes his lament over the state of mankind and draws our attention to God, one of the things that he does is he shows us that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, but the response is not then to look at money or pleasure or the comforts of this world and think that all of those things are inherently evil. They're not. As the Apostle Paul will say later in 1 Timothy chapter 6, it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. It is the love of pleasure that will corrupt your soul. It's not necessarily riches, and it's not necessarily pleasure. Instead, God has given these things to man to enjoy. That enjoyment must not be seen as the love of those things. It must not be seen as the pursuit of those things for the sake of those things. But these things, money and pleasure and comfort, have been given to man for him to enjoy as good stewards of God's gracious gifts, and all with an orientation toward God himself, fearing God as the sovereign Redeemer of his soul. Now, with that said, we must realize that Solomon is not simply decrying the inevitability of greed or the inevitability of dissatisfaction. Instead, he wants us to look at life through the prism of this carpe diem statement and to interpret life accordingly. And that's what we'll do now in chapter 6, where we come to another text that does decry the natural tendency of man to look for satisfaction in the things of this world, to look for enjoyment in things in and of themselves without reference to God. And so we will title this session, this study of Ecclesiastes 6, The Elusiveness of Satisfaction. The elusiveness of satisfaction. And we're going to see that elusiveness in 4 cases, 4 different scenarios that Solomon presents to us in chapter 6. And the table that he sets for us here in chapter 6 is like the table that has been filled with all kinds of great foods. But those foods have been corrupted because man has sought to find his enjoyment on the basis of those things alone. The first scene is found in verses 1 and 2. And it is this: it's the inability of possessions and prestige to provide satisfaction. The inability of possessions and prestige to provide satisfaction. He says in verses 1 and 2 the following: there is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is prevalent among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that his soul lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet God has not empowered him to eat from them, for a foreigner enjoys them. This is vanity and a severe affliction. Now, after describing the God-centered alternative to greed, the God-centered alternative in chapter 5, verses 18 to 20, he now returns to that topic that he had studied or that he had researched prior to that text. He looks again at the world around him, and he says, there is an evil which I have seen under the sun, a tragedy that I have seen under the sun, and it is prevalent among mankind. This echoes what he had said about greed. If we go back to chapter 5, verse 13, he says, there is a grievous evil which I have seen under the sun, riches being hoarded by the owner to his own hurt. Again, this context of life under the sun, Solomon is conceiving of or describing in terms of the mere mortal life, a life that is lived apart from the Creator, apart from fear of God. And the first object of focus here is this. He sees a man to whom God has given 3 things. Notice this: a man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor. In fact, God has given him these things to such a degree that Solomon says his soul lacks nothing of all that he desires. This man had aspirations. This man had ambitions, had wanted to achieve things in life, and God had indeed given these things to the man. The man had a great bank account, a wonderful portfolio, good holdings. He had a diversified portfolio, good resume. He had good standing in the community. All those things to which men typically aspire, God had given it to this man. And yet there's a problem. There's a problem here. In fact, we find that problem in Solomon's own life. In fact, these 3 words that are used here, the words riches, wealth, and honor, if we look at 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 12, are the very words used to describe what God gave Solomon. You remember his prayer. Solomon prayed for wisdom. God said, ask what you want and I will give it to you. And Solomon said, I need wisdom. And so God gave him wisdom, but God also then gave him riches, wealth, and honor. The same three terms used there to describe what God gave Solomon. And yet what we see in Solomon's life, there was something missing. Indeed, there is the recognition that God is sovereign in the giving of these things, but that's only half of the equation. There's an interesting parallel that we must see here between chapter 6, verse 1 and 2 in particular, and what Solomon just said in chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. And we see here the reason why the man in chapter 6 is dissatisfied, but the man in chapter 5, verses 18 to 20, is satisfied. Notice these similarities. In verse 18, Solomon said, here is what I have seen to be good and fitting. But in 6:1, he says, there is an evil which I have seen. In 5 verse 19, he said, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, there's an acknowledgement of God's sovereignty in giving. And then look at 6 verse 2. There too, there is an acknowledgement of God's sovereignty. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that his soul lacks nothing of all that he has desired. So where's the problem here? And that comes next. Notice in verse 19 of chapter 5, Solomon gives the second half of the equation. It's not just to acknowledge that God is sovereign and how he distributes wealth. The second half of the equation is this: God has also empowered the man in chapter 5, verse 19, to eat from these good things and to receive his reward and to rejoice. But notice the problem in chapter 6, verse 2. To the man who had all that he had desired, God had not empowered him to eat from them. And in fact, Solomon says someone else, some stranger, is the one who comes later to enjoy these things. In the case of the man in chapter 5, this is the gift of God. In the case of chapter 6, verse 2, this is vanity and a severe affliction. You see, here's the first reality that Solomon is pointing us to. That it's not just enough to realize that it's God who gives wealth and riches and honor. It's not enough to possess those things. There's something else that's needed, and that is the empowerment by God, the enablement by God to enjoy those things. You see, the problem isn't in riches themselves. The problem is when those riches are looked at in and of themselves as equal to or synonymous with enjoyment, and they're not. There is something else that must come. And that's why Augustine, in noting that riches themselves are not evil, but neither are they morally good. He said this: riches, lest they should thought to be evil, are given also to the good, and that they should not be esteemed great or the chiefest jewels, they are also given to the bad. You see, the problem is that men look upon riches as inherently good and see those riches and that honor as synonymous with enjoyment itself. But that is never how riches and wealth and honor were to be received. Solomon affirms that God is the sovereign giver of these things, but Solomon asserts that there is another half of the equation, and that half of the equation is that God himself must enable. God himself must provide the satisfaction in addition to those riches themselves. And without that enablement, there can never be satisfaction. Even when you think that you have achieved all of your ambitions, you've thought that you have achieved your heart's desire, you set goals, you had a strategy, You employed those things flawlessly, and your bank account filled up. You grew in status. You had wealth and possessions, and you thought that that was going to give you satisfaction. Solomon says, that's not how it works. Those things are not synonymous with satisfaction. And this lesson, this reality should inspire humility in us to recognize that the things of this world that we work for are not sources of satisfaction. It should inspire humility in us, in that satisfaction depends upon God and God alone. And then it should inspire this sincere desire that our greatest quest should be to find that satisfaction, but not in the riches, not in the possessions, not in the prestige, but in God himself and his grace. And it also reminds us never to envy the man who has the former, but not the latter. Never to envy the man who has the possessions and the prestige, but not the genuine satisfaction. And we do that often. We look at the lives of the rich and famous, the nice cars, the nice houses, and we think that's life. But as Solomon has already testified, and even as he testifies in this text, that those riches to the man who cannot enjoy them, those riches to the man who does not fear God, is like a millstone that is placed around his neck. And the more he acquires, the more elusive joy and contentment is. Walter Kaiser puts it this way: therein lies the point made by Solomon. Things are not always what they seem to be. Prosperity itself is a gift, and it is in itself, however, unfulfilling until God also gives the divine gift of the power to enjoy it. In fact, God-given wealth without God-given power to enjoy is a major malady. And that leads us to this summary. Listen, possessions and prestige in and of themselves will never produce satisfaction. Secondly, the second scenario that he describes for us is found in verses 3 to 6 of Ecclesiastes chapter 6. And it is this: it is the inability of lineage and longevity to provide this satisfaction. Notice how he describes this. He says, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, however many they may be, but his soul is not satisfied with good things, and he does not even have a proper burial, then I say, better the miscarriage than he. For it comes in futility and goes into obscurity, and its name is covered in obscurity. It never sees the sun and never knows anything. It is better off than he. Even if the other man lives 1,000 years twice and does not enjoy good things, do not all go to one place. Now, Solomon looks at a different kind of wealth here. In fact, one that would really be prized, even by many in our world today, is far superior than silver and gold. And it is the blessing of having a large family and many years, healthy years of life. Solomon says if a man fathers 100 children, that was a common ancient Near Eastern way of stating hyperbole, of emphasizing this large family of children that gathers around the table. His quiver, you could say, is full and overflowing. Who wouldn't want that? And he lives a long life. In fact, in verse 6, he talks about living 1,000 years twice. Not even Methuselah reached 1,000 years, and this is a man who lives it twice. He's got longevity. He's got the good genes. He's got the health. And yet, for this man, As Solomon describes him, there's a problem. His soul is not satisfied with good things. Verse 6, he does not enjoy good things. How could you not enjoy these good things, these children? Psalm 127, verses 3-5 says this, "Behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate." How could this be? And yet there are probably fathers in this room who can identify with this, who have been blessed with children, and yet can identify with this man. He has not found satisfaction. He thought the children would bring him satisfaction, and he came up short. Or there's men in this room who have lived long or have tremendous physiques and are living that great healthy life and yet are empty. In fact, Solomon uses a better than saying here that's shocking. He says, the miscarriage, the baby that dies in the womb, is better off than the man who lives 2,000 years and has 100 sons. That is just shocking. And to any listener, any reader in that time would have been absolutely shocked at why this would be. And Solomon says this in verses 4 and 5, "For that miscarriage comes in futility and goes into obscurity, and its name is covered in obscurity. It never sees the sun, and it never knows anything. It is better off than he." Notice the repetition of the word obscurity. The miscarriage dies in obscurity. The miscarriage is never known and does not know this life. And that miscarriage is even better than the man who's been blessed with many years and many children. How are we to understand this? One commentator says this, "What does it matter if a rich person lives for 2,000 years if that person does not enjoy the good things of life? Such a life itself is futile, not only because there's no enjoyment of it, but because eventually such a person will end up where the stillborn child ended up." End quote. So the conclusion is this: a large family and a long, healthy life will never produce satisfaction. Those are good things, but that's only half of the equation. God gives these things, but that's only part of what God can give. And again, especially in our culture today, especially among the conservative culture, you have this emphasis on making life better. How? By living more healthily, which is a good thing, and having more kids, which is a good thing. But all the emphasis is placed that you'll find satisfaction there. There's the answer to what our soul needs: more kids and a better body, more kids and a longer life. Solomon's already looked at that. And he said, if you're looking to those things to provide satisfaction, you're not going to find it there. And in fact, you're going to be worse off than the baby that dies in the womb. The third scenario is this: the inability of indulgence and imagination to provide satisfaction. Verses 7-9. Here Solomon says this: "All a man's labor is for his mouth, and yet the appetite," literally the soul, "is not satisfied. For what advantage does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage does the poor man have, knowing how to walk before the living? What the eye sees is better than what the soul desires. This too is futility and a striving after the wind." Solomon now returns to the topic of desire and insatiable desires even. And he gives us two proverbs here, one in verse 7 and one in verse 9. And in the middle, he gives two rhetorical questions. The first proverb is this, verse 7. "All a man's labor is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not satisfied." The word for mouth here refers to gratification. So all a man's labor, Solomon says, is for his gratification. Remember, he's talking about the mortal life. He's talking about the life under the sun with no reference to God. And this man, he works and he works and he works. Why? In this case, he's not even working for wealth and prestige or a large family and a long life. He is just working to gratify his appetites. And this kind of a man never finds it. He never finds it. The proverb teaches, William Barrick says, that a person living as a mere human being without God in his or her life can never find satisfaction in the quantity of possessions, wealth, children, or years of life, or in this case, in just the satisfying of the desires. Solomon then says in verse 8 these two rhetorical questions. What advantage does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage does the poor man have knowing how to walk before the living? Two rhetorical questions. And there's three categories of men that are listed here. Kind of the three categories that would basically comprise all of society. You have the wise men. Who are they? They're the skilled ones. This is not wisdom in the sense of fearing the Lord. This is just wisdom in knowing how to live a skillful life. One who's able to achieve success in the world through his insight and intelligence. That's the wise man. Then you have the fool. And the fool has no intelligence. He has no insight. His life is characterized by failure and scorn. And then you have the poor man. And the poor man is typically that way because of either injustice or because of calamity. He has nothing superfluous. He has a very simple, uncomplicated life. He just has a very simple way. He just exists. And Solomon says, who has the advantage? Look at these three men. Who has the advantage? And the answer to these questions is no one. If you do not have satisfaction in life, if you do not find joy and contentment, it doesn't matter whether you're skillful and can make lots of money. It doesn't matter whether you're a fool and you blow it all. It doesn't matter whether you're a poor man and eke out an existence. If you can't find satisfaction in this life, there's no advantage to any of those classes. It's actually important for us to recognize, because so much in our world is about this class warfare. And Solomon says, away with all these ideas of class warfare, who's richer, who deserves what, and so on. None of that in the end is going to matter if there's no satisfaction anyway. Richard Belcher says, in both cases, there is no satisfaction. The wise are not satisfied with material wealth that may accompany wise living, and the poor are not satisfied with the basic needs of life. Whether one is wealthy or poor, the basic thesis remains. The appetite is never satisfied. Or as Charles Bridges says, the man's external condition let me say that again. A man's external condition in natural satisfaction is far more equalized than appears on the surface. Each has his station and his work. Happy indeed are they who labor in dependence upon him who alone can bless their work. In other words, as I said, away with all the class warfare stuff. That's not what this is all about. Who has more, who has less. It's about, do you find satisfaction in life? That's the real quest. And if you can't find satisfaction, it doesn't matter whether you've lived skillfully in this world. He then provides another proverb in verse 9. The first part of verse 9 reads this: what the eye see is better than what the soul desires. What the eye sees refers to that which is already possessed, that which is already in the hands. It's something concrete. And Solomon says, you know what? In reality, that which is in the hands is better than that which the soul desires. That which the soul desires refers to that which the soul wants but does not yet have. That which the soul makes as its object of want. You could even say its object of lust. And this proverb is similar to the proverb that we even say today, right? A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. If you already have something, it's better than twice as much what you don't have. And that's what Solomon is saying here. But he's acknowledging this fact. When you look at it in the broader context, he's acknowledging this fact that our lives, at least as they are lived out in the natural sense, in the natural world, according to our flesh, our lives are far more defined by what the soul wants rather than what the eye sees. We're defined by our next list of things we want to buy, or our next list of objectives we want to accomplish. Our lives are defined by this constant imagination of what would make life better, rather than appreciation of what is already possessed. And Solomon says this is futility and a striving after the wind. And actually, it's the last time he's going to say that in the book. The first half of the book here is coming to a close, and he's going to start a new section after this transitional point, really, in chapter 6, verses 10 to 12. He's getting ready for what he's going to accomplish next, and he describes all of this seeking and lusting and desiring and striving as futility and a striving after the wind. Again, to quote Charles Bridges, he says this, "For what can be more wretched than when the false pictures of the world palm themselves upon us for realities, when the shadows begin to pass away and there is no substance to supply their place." In other words, what Bridges and what Solomon here is saying is this: indulgence and imagination, indulgence and lust will never produce satisfaction. Imagining what could be, imagining what ifs, and spending your time upon those things, Solomon says, will never give you any satisfaction. You're not going to find it in your imagination. You're also not going to find it in your indulgences. And that kind of leads to this fourth scenario, which is really a transitional paragraph that ushers us into the second half of the book, but it still ties to what Solomon is speaking of here. And this fourth scenario we can define this way, that resistance and refutation also will not give you satisfaction. What am I talking about here? Let's look at verses 10 to 12. Whatever exists has already been named, and it is known what man is, for he cannot dispute with him who is stronger than he is. For there are many words which increase futility. What then is the advantage to a man? For who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile life? He will spend them like a shadow. For who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? As I said, verses 10 to 12 here serve as this middle section, this transition, this hinge from the first half of the book to the second. And here, really, Solomon summarizes some important truths that he's really looked at throughout the entire first half of the book. And he also, at the same time, summarizes what the message is going to be of the second half of the book. And it's all centered on this reality that he keeps coming back to, the reality that we no longer live in the garden. We live in the world that is under the curse, a world that is marred by sin and the judgment of sin. It reminds us of Genesis 3:19. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, God says to Adam, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you will return. Solomon is essentially saying all the conclusions that he made in this immediate context of chapter 6, and really everything that he has said up to this point cannot be refuted. This is reality in the world outside the garden. And he gives us a few important lessons to take from these verses real quickly. Verse 10, first of all, we must recognize that God is irresistibly sovereign and inscrutably wise. Solomon says, whatever exists has already been named, and it is known what man is, for he cannot dispute him who is stronger than he is. This present world and all the struggles that we face is not some kind of random accident. Solomon here is saying these things, these experiences have been determined by one who has the authority to name. And in the ancient Middle East, in the ancient Near East, in those days, to give a name to something indicated authority. God has the authority to name. God also possesses perfect knowledge of man. It is known what man is. And third, God cannot be resisted. That's his irresistible sovereignty. For who can dispute with him who is stronger than he is? And here's the lesson from that reality that God is irresistibly sovereign and inscrutably wise. Satisfaction is not going to be found in trying to resist this sovereignty and this wisdom. Charles Swindoll put it well. He said, so long as I fight the hand of God, I do not learn the lessons he is attempting to place before me. And Solomon is saying this, listen, if you need to be on a quest for satisfaction, but so long as you are punching back at the hand of providence, regardless of what he has put into your life, you will not find satisfaction. In fact, you could say this, that some of the most unpleasant people to be with, the most unsatisfied people to be with are those who are angry at God. And they think their dissatisfaction is the reason to be angry at God, when in reality, their dissatisfaction is the consequence of them being angry at God. Verse 11, for there are many words which increase futility. What then is the advantage to man? There are many words which increase futility. What Solomon is emphasizing here is that man is never able to mount a justified and successful refutation of God and his ways. The more he speaks in defense of himself and in accusations against God, the more he speaks, the more deeper he digs into dissatisfaction. It reminds us of Job. Job went through something similar to this. And it reminds us of the end of the book of Job, where finally God does appear to Job. God never answers Job's questions. He doesn't answer any of them. He just reveals himself and his inscrutable wisdom and irresistible sovereignty to Job. And what do we find in Job chapter 40, verse 3 and 4? Job answered Yahweh and said, behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Or Romans chapter 9, verse 20, where in the context there, Paul uses the analogy of the potter and the clay. And Paul says there, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this? Will it? What Solomon is saying back here in chapter 6, verse 11 is that the more you try to answer back to God in your circumstances, why you haven't been given enough money and that perfect family and those perfect circumstances, that good job, and because God hasn't given you those things, you cannot be satisfied. Solomon is saying the more of that kind of nonsense that you speak, the more you'll plunge yourself into dissatisfaction. And then verse 12, for who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime? Another rhetorical question here. Who knows what is good for man during the few years, during that fleeting life? Who knows? Man spends them like a shadow. For who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? And the rhetorical question here He doesn't mention the answer, but the answer is there's only one who can do this, and it's God. Only God knows what is good. Often the reality of it is, and all of us have been there at some point, where we have thought that if this happens to me, it will make me happy. It's something good. And it doesn't happen, and we get upset. And then over time, we grow and we learn. We look back on that and realize that what we thought good was evil. And what we thought evil was actually good. Only God knows what is good for man in this brief life. Only God can reveal to man what lies behind this fleeting existence that we live. And this is to engender within us a great deal of humility and seeking after him as the only one who can enable us to find satisfaction. One commentator says this: Solomon carefully demolishes every question and every observation that mere mortals might offer in the process of questioning the Creator's wisdom. Point by point, Solomon draws the reader to the conclusion that only God can control man's destiny. The reason things are the way that they are is due to the fact the sovereign Lord of creation does it that way for his own purposes. And so in response, as it relates to the issue of satisfaction, listen to the words of Charles Bridges. Learn the lesson of prostrate submission. To contend is to add madness to folly. To submit is thy security and thy rest. To contend is the very cause of your dissatisfaction. To submit is where you will find satisfaction. Resistance and refutation against the will and providence of God will never lead you to satisfaction. Just a final couple of applications as we hear the preacher. Number one, don't judge books by their covers. Riches are deceiving. You look out, you see the lives of the rich and famous, and you might say, I wish I could be in their shoes. Realize that in the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, they're empty. Dead on the inside. Not a lick of satisfaction. Don't judge a man's life by what you see on the outside and that veneer that's there. Matters is what's on the inside. Has God enabled that person to enjoy? Number two, satisfaction can be found. In fact, it must be the pursuit of all of our lives. You don't want to talk with somebody who says, I don't want any satisfaction in this life. What is that? What kind of a stewardship is that for one created in the image of God? No, we must seek satisfaction, but it is only found in the Creator, in this Redeemer who gives these gifts, who is gracious. Number three, the quickest way up is down. Humble yourself under God's mighty hand. God doesn't just dangle satisfaction like a carrot on a stick in some kind of deceiving way. It will appear that way if you're proud. You'll never get it. You'll keep reaching and you'll never catch it. But you submit yourself, you put yourself in the dust. You prostrate yourself under God's mighty hand, and then that's where you'll find the satisfaction. Submit, as Charles Bridges said. Number four, it's not too late. Some of you are hearing this and you're weeping. You hear this and you go, this quest for satisfaction and this constant inability to find it is the story of my life. It's over. No, it's not. You're still here. You still have been given some days in this fleeting life. And so today is the day when you can do what Solomon says: prostrate yourself in the dust. Fear God. Place that reverential faith in this Creator and Redeemer, this one who is the source of both the good things in life and the ability to enjoy them. And if you come to Him in that humility of faith and fear, He will give it to you. I like what Augustine said, and we'll leave it in the language of Augustine when he said this: "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee." I trust that is your experience, that you have found rest, satisfaction in the Creator. And if not, it's still today. It's still not too late. Make sure you talk to someone here tonight to find the satisfaction that comes in our Creator and Redeemer. Let's pray. Father, we are again convicted by the words that we have read from Solomon's pen. As we go through these different scenarios in Ecclesiastes 6, we find ourselves in many of these words, seeking satisfaction in the things themselves: wealth, prestige, health, family, intelligence, imaginations, even in our own resistance and rebellion against you. But we thank you that in you there's grace and mercy, there is forgiveness, and there is peace, and there is rest. I pray that as a response to this, we would seek satisfaction even greater, but be laser-focused in that pursuit, identifying the object of the pursuit to be not these other things of this world, but to be you and you alone. And to find that ultimately in Jesus Christ, your Son, whom you sent to manifest in the flesh true life. It's in His name that we pray. Amen.